Our friends, the gospel speaks to us today about communicating the faith in a way. It's communicating through compassion, as we've heard, that we're not to judge, we're not to condemn, we are to pardon, we are to forgive. It's communicating generosity and magnanimity. It's preaching, as the saying goes, preaching and, if necessary, using words. It's about communicating what it is that we believe in. And I think the gospel and indeed the first reading that we've listened to gets that across. We teach what Scripture calls, St. Paul says, the things that no eye has seen and no ear has heard, things beyond the mind of humanity, all that God has prepared for those who love him. That has to be communicated. That has to be expressed. And every time that we come to Mass, every time that we hear a homily, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, every time that we're brought into the context of faith and we hear words, especially the Word of God, we should take that upon ourselves and just maybe with a word or a phrase or some aspect, interiorize that in order to exteriorize it for the proclamation of the faith. So we have as our guest speaker this afternoon someone who knows that quite well, Pat Coyle. She's originally from Derry. She's the Director of Communications for the Jesuits in Ireland. She's an expert in communications and has spent, as part of her professional life, 14 years working with RTE and I believe 6 years working with the BBC, and has a vast array of knowledge and skill and expertise in this area. I'm building her up now here a little bit. And she will be speaking to us on how to communicate the faith in the 21st century, a spirituality for authentic communication in the 21st century. She's already conducted a workshop which went down extremely well at 12 o'clock. There's another one again at 6 o'clock, and I'll speak more about that towards the end of the ceremony. So I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Pat Coyle.
Good evening, and it's a privilege to be here in Knock with you today and to speak to you. I want to begin by telling you a joke that I think might illustrate something of what I want to do today. And it's for the smokers, particularly among you. It's a bit of good news. A Jesuit friend of mine tells us in his book on Ignatian spirituality, a Franciscan and a Jesuit were both good friends and heavy smokers, and they found it difficult to pray for long without having a cigarette. So they decided to ask their superiors for permission to smoke whilst they prayed. The next time they met, the Franciscan looked downcast. I asked my superior if I could smoke while I prayed, and he got angry and said, "No." The Jesuit smiled. I asked my superior if I could pray whilst I smoked. And he said, "Of course you can." Now it's a good communications tip for reframing the question when you want to try and get what you want. But from a spiritual perspective, there's a deeper and authentic message that God can be found in the ordinariness of everyday life, as St. Ignatius, founder of the Jesuits, would put it. And I want to look today at some of the spiritual wisdom of the message of Christ and shine its light on some of the not so authentic messages that we can get swamped by today in this age of mass communication, digital and traditional. I want to begin by talking about the Catholic theologian John Shea, who has written some wonderful commentaries on all of the Gospels. And his core message is really what I'm trying to convey today. You see, he says that Jesus is unlike any other communicator or unlike any of the communications that we are familiar with today, in that Jesus is not just about conveying information, words, 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 images, 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 stories, stories, stories. He says Jesus is an encounter. And when he meets people, you're encountering a higher consciousness, and Jesus is bent on opening up whomever he meets to the Spirit dwelling within them. and that everything that Jesus says is geared to the spiritual transformation of his disciples, of the crowds, of the religious authorities, the Pharisees and the scribes, and individual seekers like you and me. Jesus' communication is to transform us. And what does being spiritually transformed mean? Well, the first thing is, it means knowing that we are not perfect. John Shea tells a beautiful spiritual story about this, about God setting up a stall in the marketplace. And it's a fruit and vegetable stall, and the people around are really excited, and they all go in, and a woman gets in first, and she goes up and she says, "Okay, God, I'll have a perfect turnip, a perfect melon, perfect bag of spuds, and a perfect apple." And God looks at her and says, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I only do seeds." God does not do perfection. God does growth and love and nurturing and forgiveness. So we grow and get better. And being spiritually transformed means knowing that. It means knowing that we are loved, and knowing also, as St. Paul would have said, that we do the things we don't want to do, and we don't do the things that we do want to do. And it's only from that space that we then, if we want to communicate the message, that's the place we have to go to. We have to be transformed ourselves continually in that encounter, in that continuing encounter as we hear the gospel today, so that we can go out then and visit the sick and the prisoner, feed the hungry, care for the homeless, house the homeless, and care for the gifts that God has given us, especially the sacred earth, where not one sparrow falls to the ground without the Father knowing it, that we seek justice for the marginalized in our society, and that we're aware of that. The danger is, though, in this world of mass communication, where heads are more likely to be bent down into the smartphone than in prayer, and that would include mine, I can tell you, we end up mesmerized and, if not paralyzed and depressed even, by the drama of never-ending news and negativity. There's a lovely poem by Roger McGough. He's a Liverpool poet, very short. He entitles the poem Survivor. I'm going to read it for you. "Every day I think about dying, about disease, starvation, violence, terrorism, war, the end of the world. It helps keep my mind off things." We all know that, don't we? Getting caught up in the drama and blaming them, and it's all out there. And then we fail to ask the inward questions. The question like, why? Why is there war? Why is there suffering? And in our 21st century, the answer to that, the dominant narrative or story that we are bombarded with regarding questions like these, and it's the purveyors of it in mass media and people and sometimes ourselves, the answer is one where it comes where there's no reference to God or to a bigger framework. It's like what Paul is talking about in the first reading there, that hidden wisdom. That is a huge change in our Western world, in our country, in our society, in our families, and maybe even in ourselves. Because then there's no overarching framework or narrative that can help create meaning from what we're getting today. The narrative we get tells us suffering is futile, incomprehensible, and meaningless. And as somebody who has, grown-up children now in their 20s, and, their faith would be very wobbly. It wouldn't be mine. It wouldn't be like mine, and they're struggling. And when they have suffered, and they have deeply suffered through bereavement of close friends, and they're left wondering, it is very hard for me to speak to them when they don't have that meta-narrative, that bigger framework. In the past, where we would have said, look, it'll all work out, God is look after it, they're in the arms of God. All of that is a different language nowadays, and it's constrained. Christianity has a different narrative. It doesn't say that suffering is a good in itself or that God ever wills that we suffer. But it does acknowledge that suffering is a real and present part of the mystery that is being a human being. If anyone wants to be a follower of mine, let them take up their cross and follow me. That's the hard reality. And any of you and the people here who've lived your lives know that suffering. There is a cross to be taken up. But it's also, Jesus says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So as well as taking up the cross, we take up the yoke. And the yoke means that Jesus walks beside us in our suffering. And I think sometimes we come, and I do this, I pray up, I come to knock, and I pray up to Mary and up to God. And Jesus is saying, you're yoked to me. When you yoke to me, my burden is light. I'm carrying it with you. Our Christian narrative acknowledges also, as Franciscan theologian Richard Rohr would say, that deep spiritual growth rarely takes place except in some context of suffering. It can deepen us, make us bitter or better. And it tells us, as Pope Francis has done, that happiness and joy can coexist along with pain and suffering. Christianity offers hope. We know how the story ends, and it's not with crucifixion. It's with the resurrection. And I'm looking at those beautiful stations of the cross. There is a light in every one of them. The light of resurrection shines through the crucifixion. And in our lives of suffering, it's not just about the suffering. The suffering is shot through with the reality of the risen Christ, and that's where the power lies. So sickness, poverty, suicide, mental illness, relationships that break down, and the wear and tear of everyday life is all part of the mysterious pattern of human life. We live, we die, we rise. We live, we die, we rise. We live, we die, we rise. Until our final dying and rising. Rohr says also that as Christians, we believe that we are saved by the death and resurrection of Jesus. The key is to put the two together, like those stations do. And when we do that, we can then entrust, we know that we have the power of God within even the darkest situation, if we trust. And trust is a key thing. And a person who knew that, and I love him deeply from what I've read, is John the 23rd. He knew that encounter with God, and it spoke to the world and spoke to his life. And there was a revealing story told that I read in a book by his secretary about his nighttime ritual. It was during the time of the Second Vatican Council. And Pope John the 23rd, there were huge upheavals going on within the church, millions of Catholics wondering what's going to happen next. Political instability, cold wars were the order of the day in the wider world, and John himself was painfully isolated from his curia. Now, each night he would kneel down on his prie-dieu in his little chapel, but for a very short period of time. Finally, his secretary picked up the courage and said to him one night, what do you do when you're praying there? And Pope John the 23rd said, I say, God, it's your church. You look after it. I'm going to bed. Theologian and well-known spiritual writer Henry Nouwen, in his last book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, said that he got so overwhelmed by the negativity of modern communication, he was writing in the 90s, that he'd got accustomed to living with sadness, sometimes really like a mild depression that we can have. And he said he'd lost the eyes to see the joy and to hear the gladness that belongs to God, and which he says is found in the hidden corners of the world. Can you find joy in the hidden corners of your life, no matter how painful it is? The dominant narrative today will tell you absolutely not. It claims that happiness means the absence of pain. But spiritual wisdom says joy and suffering can be soulmates. Pope Francis, in Rejoice and Be Glad, his latest letter, says that one of the ways of finding God's joy is through laughter. Now, I learned that lesson some time ago whilst nursing my father. He had Alzheimer's and lung cancer, and my sisters and mum nursed him at home in his bedroom and calmed him down if he got distressed. And we listened to a wonderful local radio station, NWCR Northwest Community Radio, broadcast from a shop in neighbouring Buncrana. It was the early days of local radio, and we loved it, not least for its rough and ready nature. One day, the presenter of the afternoon show got very animated about a record request for a local man called Mickey, who'd reached the amazing age of 111. What an achievement, he enthused, and he repeated his age, 111, several times. After playing the record requested, the presenter came back on air, and his voice was a wee bit more subdued. Mickey's wife has been on to us to clear something up. Mickey isn't 111. He's ill. We laughed, and because we laughed, Daddy, who didn't know what we were laughing at, roared and laughed too, and sheer joy filled the room of a sick and dying man, and God was present in the joy. Now, I want to finish my talk today, but it wouldn't be complete without something about fake news. We'll say nothing about the man across the water. But whoever coined that phrase, the truth is there's a lot of it out there. And it's a bit like the promise made to me, because we talk about advertising, and I am a sucker for advertising, which we're bombarded with. This is, and I buy it, I bought into it, the Midnight Recovery Facial Serum. This was to take away all my wrinkles, right? It is, and I quote from the label, a replenishing elixir of pure essential oils to visibly restore the appearance of skin by morning. I wasn't aware that my skin might disappear during the night. Glad that it reappeared. I love it, but I love it for something. Here's what I love it for. I love it because it's got a little squirter yolk inside. Do you see this? That squirter yolk, like you would use for your ears, reminds me of a beautiful experience of how God communicated with me as my father died in our home in Derry. He went into a coma, so it was difficult to get water into his mouth. My mother was at her wit's end, and I suggested if we had an eardrop squirter yoke, we might be able to squirt the water into the back of his throat. I was grasping at straws. We had no such thing, but we muddled through the day. That night, as I was putting my 3-year-old niece Stephanie to bed in our house, a full moon was shining through the landing window as we climbed the stairs, and the despairing thought crossed my mind that as my heart was breaking, God was as impassive and indifferent as the moon. Do you know or care that my beloved Daddy is dying? I heard myself say. Or are you like the distant God who winds up the clockwork universe and retires? I read Stephanie her stories, and as I was leaving her bedroom, she called me back, once to tell her another story, the next time to give her another kiss. I was exasperated by the third time she called me, anxious to get back to Daddy downstairs. So I went into her and said, "This better be good." "I have a present for you," she sing-songed. And pulling back her duvet, she produced an eardrop squirter. Just like this. "I had sore ears one time," she said. "My mommy got that for me, and I kept it for you." 2 days later, my father died. He weighed 5.5 stone, and all his major organs had broken down. But the angel Stephanie in a town called Derry had brought us the good news that God was indeed the Word made flesh, communicating with us through sign and symbol, and urging us to follow love into mystery and into silence. For when all the talking is done, silence is also God's way of communicating with us, as mystic John of the Cross reminds us. Silence allows us to be truly present to ourselves, to another, and to God. Jesus chose silence for a time before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate felt the disturbing power of his presence. From the earliest days, Mary was left pondering much in the painful silence of her sorrowful heart. And here in Knock, we have the only Marian shrine in the world where no words were spoken. The silent vision was enough to deeply comfort poor, simple people, hungry in body and hungry for God. Their wordless encounter is still feeding us today. The communication is deep and authentic. If we choose to open our hearts to encounter it, as they did, we will be transformed. And in turn, we will transform our families, our country, and our world.
We come now to the sacrament of the sick. This is a very special part of a pilgrimage to Our Lady's Shrine. When we come as pilgrims to Knock, we come principally to pray